All right, if you are just joining us for our webinar this morning on the situation in Jerusalem, you are in the right place. We're going to give this just a little bit of time for more people to file into our Zoom room, and then we'll get started. So just bear with us a couple of more minutes or seconds maybe. All right, it is the top of the hour. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. If people arrive late, they will miss the introductions, but I want to be very respectful of everyone's time, and particularly the time of our guests who have joined us on very short notice at a very busy time. So good morning and welcome. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar entitled Jerusalem on the Verge, Dispossession and Violence in Sheikh Jarrah. So the context for today's webinar is what we're seeing happening today on the ground in East Jerusalem, where the struggle in Sheikh Jarrah is again on center stage. And once again, Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah are facing imminent evictions approved by Israeli courts. And once again, Palestinians of Sheikh Jarrah are resisting efforts to remove them from their longtime homes. And they are once again being met with violence and repression from Israeli authorities and Israeli settlers. So to discuss this struggle and the dynamics in Jerusalem and how both are part of the broader struggle against escalating Israeli policies of Palestinian dispossession in Jerusalem and beyond, I am very happy and honored really to be joined by two experts, and you can find their full bios on the Foundation for Middle East Peace's website. I'll go through them very briefly here. First, we have Aseel AlBajeh. Aseel is a legal researcher and advocacy officer at Al-Haq, which is the well-known Palestinian human rights organization. Aseel was awarded the Ireland-Palestine Scholarship Program to study at the Irish Centre for Human Rights at National University of Ireland, Galway, completing her LLM in International Human Rights Law in 2020. Second, we have Budour Hassan, who is a Palestinian writer, a journalist, and a legal researcher based in Jerusalem. Her work has appeared in outlets like Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Huffington Post, and Mada Masr, among others. So before we get started, very quickly, some housekeeping. The format for today's webinar, as always, is going to be a discussion between myself and our panelists. It's going to go for an hour and 15 minutes or so. It's being recorded. It's being live streamed on Facebook. Hello, everyone on Facebook. And we will be taking questions via the Q&A box. You can submit them at any time during this webinar. I will be keeping an eye on the Q&A box and weaving as many of these questions into our discussion as possible. Don't put them in the chat box. I won't see them. As for the chat box, I have colleagues behind the scenes who will be using the chat box to give you important updates, resources. When one of our panelists mentions something, there'll be resources linked to it, and other useful things that you'll want to keep an eye on. And you can also use the chat box if you have any problems with this webinar and you want to raise that with my colleagues behind the scenes. And finally, I would note that we have enabled closed captioning function for those who prefer or need to read rather than hear the discussion. And if you have any trouble with that, write your question into the Q&A and we will deal with it. So with that, we're going to just dive right in. We're going to start off with the sort of breaking news. And Aseel, I want to start with you. Today it was a big day, in theory, for the 4 families in Sheikh Jarrah who are facing dispossession with a legal date. This was a legal date for them when they had to do something. So can you fill us in on what that was about and if anything happened? And just sort of as background, the eviction of these 4 families was scheduled actually for May 2nd, but that was delayed by a court. And today was a date when it was one of the trigger dates for what happens next. So Aseel, if you could jump in first with this background. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. As you said, yes, today is, but every day is an important date for the families of Sheikh Jarrah. But specifically, as you said, the families, 4 families consisting of 30 Palestinians in East Jerusalem were ordered to leave their homes by Jerusalem District Court by 2nd of May, which was a couple of days ago, and they appealed this order to the Israeli Supreme Court. And basically at the session on a couple of days ago, the judge gave the families a political, I would say this is a political offer for them to accept that the settler organization has rights, ownership rights to the lands of Sheikh Jarrah, and so to be awarded or afforded a protected tenancy status and to pay rent for the settler organization. Now, immediately after, the judge gave them a period of 2 to 3 days to decide with the settler organization. Now, immediately after this political offer, the families issued their positions that they reject such a political offer, since we will talk more in detail about the specifics of the case of Sheikh Jarrah, but they rejected the offer. And as such, today the decision was delivered by the families to the Supreme Court, and the families again postponed the hearing till the 10th of May in a couple of days. But I would like to mention here, like, some important stuff about this Israeli court sessions is that, first of all, these courts apply Israeli domestic law unlawfully, which is unlawfully transferred to the occupied East Jerusalem, and that these laws themselves are also discriminatory in their nature. These are part of Israel's apartheid regime. And in East Jerusalem, these laws are specifically used to dispossess and displace Palestinians furthermore. So this is in terms of the laws that we're talking about that the courts are imposing, but also the courts themselves are very much discriminatory and untransparent, given the experience of the Sheikh Jarrah families, but also with all Jerusalemites who have been experiencing a discriminatory treatment by these courts. And I would like to say that when these families, Sheikh Jarrah families, resort to the Israeli courts, they're not acknowledging or trusting these courts, but rather they are trying to exhaust all the means that they have in order to, at this time, just to save time, even to have some time for them to be to have the right fulfilled. And in some cases also the courts have like evictions have happened while the courts were cases were pending. Maybe Budour has firsthand experience working, since she has been working in East Jerusalem longer than that, with the Shamasna family. In 2017, the family was evicted while still an appeal was pending. In East Jerusalem. This is also in Sheikh Jarrah, another part of the neighborhood. So I think it's important to keep all these things in mind while we're talking about the Israeli courts in occupied East Jerusalem.
Thanks, Aseel. And just, I mean, maybe we can talk about this more in the rest of the conversation somewhere, but I think for people, I think my colleagues put something into the chat about this, so you can read about the legislation. But I mean, fundamentally, the laws that are being applied were written to dispossess Palestinians. I mean, they're written to enable Israeli Jews to reclaim land or right of return to lands from pre-48 or pre-67, and they are written to prevent Palestinian claims being made. So I mean, there's that fundamental structural piece of it that works that way. I'd love if one of you could talk more about that as we go on. Budour, over to you. So, and Aseel just referred to this, you know, what's happening this week is not the only urgent case in Sheikh Jarrah. Can you explain what is happening with the additional cases of dispossession that are looming? And here, I mean, I'm thinking about the 7 families that are facing August eviction, I believe it is. You know, talk about the larger battle unfolding, which isn't a new battle, it's been going on for decades, but what's unfolding today between Palestinians and the settlers and the Israeli state and the courts.
Yeah, so as Aseel said, we're talking about 4 families that were supposed to be, I will say, displaced on the 2nd of May. In addition to these 4 families, An additional 3 families are also facing displacement orders for August, because in February 2021, when the Israeli District Court approved the decision of the Magistrate Court to displace all these families, we had 2 cases, or we have 2 groups of cases almost just separated by a couple of weeks. In both cases, the District Court upheld the decision previously issued by the Magistrate Courts. So, and in many cases, we're talking about very similar cases in nature. We're talking about refugee families who've been living in Sheikh Jarrah since 1956 and who've been embroiled in a decades-long legal battle and who've been hovering under this threat of displacement for decades. In cases, you have children who've lived their entire lives with this weapon of displacement just directed at their chests, really, and have known nothing but court dates, and when the court is expected to displace us. So this is the wider context. So when we're talking about these specific 4 families that will be displaced soon, and the additional 3 families, and in addition we have the Sabbagh family, whose case is a little bit different. So it's not being heard along with these 7 families, but they're also part of the case. So we're talking about more than 70 people, including many children, who are facing the threat of displacement as we speak. And unlike previous cases when the Israeli settler organization, specifically Nahlat Shim'on, which is registered in the United States and received exemptions from paying taxes, certain exemptions, as a supposedly charitable organization, because it's registered as a charitable organization in the United States. So when Nahlat Shim'on comes and displaces families, they usually kind of have a typical pattern of displacing one family at a time. And since 2009, with the exception of the Chamasni case, which happened in 2017, which is a bit different because Chamasnis were not refugee families, and they were in a different part of Sheikh Jarrah, not in the Karm al-Jaouni area. All the cases we're talking about, they're all in the Karm al-Jaouni area. But apart from the Chamasni case, we've seen no displacement since 2009. And it was believed that partly due to political pressure, also largely due to the mobilization by residents, by Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah. But now the difference is that the settler organization, Nahlat Shim'on, is not really waiting anymore. They really want to do this displacement by droves. And this is one major difference between what we're seeing now and what we've seen years before, that we're talking about a huge number of families, which means that the whole dynamics is changing, because we're not just talking about an individual family. We're talking literally about entire families, dozens of residents, entire lives being torn apart from where they have lived for decades.
Thank you. And before we go sort of more into the broader story, I want to continue focusing on where things are today. And Budour, I want to stick with you here. A lot of us, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. I know around the world, a lot of us are sort of glued to, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, seeing what's happening on the ground. I mean, this is, for all the negatives of social media, this is a positive. We're seeing it. Can you talk about, I know you are spending a lot of time in Sheikh Jarrah. I know you were there, I think you're there almost every night. Can you talk about what these nightly protests are? These are being led by Palestinians. The families in Sheikh Jarrah, I know, are close, from what I see on social media, deeply involved in leading this. And can you talk about that role that they're playing and the retaliation that you're seeing on the ground from Israeli authorities?
Since the start of Ramadan, the Muslim month of fasting, and basically, which means 2 weeks into April, there have been daily, nightly clashes, let's say, between Palestinian youth, specifically in Damascus Gate, and protest at Israeli measures meant of blocking people from arriving at the steps of Damascus Gate. And the momentum that these protests have created in Damascus Gate didn't just stay there. We all the youngsters who go to the protests in Damascus Gate, many of whom had no prior political involvement or direct political involvement, in the sense that they didn't go to protests. Because when we talk about politics, politics really infiltrates every single aspect of Palestinian lives. So we don't really have the luxury not to be political in the broader sense of the word. So due to the calls made by families in Sheikh Jarrah and the massive effort they have played both locally in mobilizing and in inviting people and calling on people, staging even concerts in Sheikh Jarrah, by taking advantage of the fact that, unlike in other months, Jerusalem usually sleeps early, but in Ramadan, it changes. So people stay up for late. It's a very public month. Many things, many activities are held after 8, 9 p.m. So the families in Sheikh Jarrah very cleverly took advantage of this fact and started calling on people to join them, to watch shows, as a statement, political statement, that we're staying here. In retaliation fest, you'd hear settlers starting play loud music, very annoying music from their speakers from the houses that they have occupied, particularly the house of Nabil al-Kurd. So this is one of the centers in which they play their very loud and very annoying music in order to hijack any attempt of Palestinians to gather, to protest, to do even the most civic activity, which is just sitting there having their iftar, which is the meal of breaking the fast together publicly in Sheikh Jarrah. And especially in the last week, this has developed. So instead of just holding these evening gatherings, the momentum, as I said, morphed from these just daily evening protests in Damascus Gate and reached Sheikh Jarrah, particularly because there have been attempts to block Palestinian youth from reaching Damascus Gate. So it's, instead of just going back to their homes, people started joining in and protesting. In addition, we've seen also, and this is one of the most really lively, inspiring things about the protests, that you don't just have Palestinians from Jerusalem coming and Palestinian from neighboring villages in Jerusalem like Isawiye, like Shurfat, like Wadi al-Jawz. You also have Palestinians from Haifa, from all over historic Palestine, from Haifa, from al-Fahim, from Taiba, these are areas in southern or northern historic Palestine, coming, some of whom just using public transport and coming, many university students, college students who are coming and joining. And you also have people, and the really beautiful thing is how this translates into the chanting of people. So you have chants that are symbolic to some area of Palestine being repeated in Sheikh Jarrah. You have all the symbolic and iconic chants, slogans, the famous songs of that are sung, some of them that were adapted to the case of Sheikh Jarrah. And this is how Palestinians started resisting these attempts, especially there was a massive protest on Saturday, which gathered many Palestinians from all over historic Palestine came. And after that, it continued every night despite repression. And when we talk about repression by Israel, we talk about use of sound grenades by the Israeli border police. Obviously, the use of the skunk truck, which is the foul-smelled water. Usually, it was first used in Damascus Gate, and they transferred this truck that fires the skunk water. They spray the homes with skunk. They spray protesters with skunk, and on certain occasions they also even use tear gas. So these are the ways, and obviously with the horses. And whenever you start standing, singing, and even raising the Palestinian flag, because in Jerusalem, the very act of raising the Palestinian flag is perceived by Israeli occupation police as a threat to their very fake sovereignty over this area. So whenever the Palestinian flag is raised, you will have the hordes of Israeli soldiers attacking whoever who's raising the flag, brutally beating protesters. And we've seen some of the scenes where Palestinian protesters, unarmed protesters, were beaten brutally, were harassed, were detained. So this is the way it has been, and I think that it will continue today also. After iftar, we will be gathering in Sheikh Jarrah, and also every day, just to carry on, to keep this momentum going, and to say that the case of Sheikh Jarrah is not just the case of one neighborhood. It's not even the case of one city, which is Jerusalem. It's a Palestinian case because it's a paradigmatic of the entire Palestinian struggle for liberation and decolonization.
Thank you. Aseel, can you add on to that a little bit in terms of what you think these protests can accomplish, what the goals of the protests are, both in a limited sense on Sheikh Jarrah and more broadly? And maybe, I don't want to skip ahead too far, but how you see this, there have been there have been moments in history, including one not that long ago, the grassroots protest against the magnetometers on the Haram al-Sharif, where you've actually seen real impact when there's been grassroots, or even taking down the barriers at Damascus Gate. Is this something where that kind of victory might be replicated, or is it somehow a different test?
I think what Budour said in regards to how these protests are not only about Sheikh Jarrah and not only about Jerusalem, they represent the anger by the Palestinian youth who have been suppressed and denied from the right to expression and the right to exercise the right self-determination. So now we are seeing a great mobilization, particularly by Palestinian youth. And as Budour also said, we're seeing Palestinians from what is now considered Israel also joining these protests. And in this, I would say that the goal of the message of these protests is, first of all, to stop the evictions themselves, but overall to protest what Israel has always been doing, which is in Jerusalem specifically, to empty the city from its Palestinian residents, and to ensure, as they publicly state shamelessly, that they want to ensure the demographic composition of the city is in favor of Israeli Jewish domination. So the various, like forced eviction and Sheikh Jarrah is just one example, because every single neighborhood of Jerusalem is under the threat of displacement and dispossession under various pretexts, legal, because Israel does practice dispossession and displacement under its rule of law, and rule of law here does not equal justice. The Israeli discriminatory laws are designed, as we said, to displace and dispossess Palestinians. And so these protests are a sign and a message in order to stop all these settler colonial policies in East Jerusalem, but also elsewhere, because we've seen in the past couple of months also protests in al-Faham, in the Gaza Strip, under various pretexts and in different forms in historic Palestine. These policies to displace Palestinians and to have in historic Palestine minimum a number of Palestinians as possible are taking various forms, but the Palestinian youth have the same message, which is to ensure that their land remain with them and that they are liberated from the Israeli colonization.
I would like to add one thing regarding the efficacy of these protests. I like the fact that you brought up the successful sit-in that took place in 2017 against the installation of the metal detectors in Haram al-Sharif. And really, it's very similar. It's really all the time. It's when we saw the way the youth in Damascus Gate removed the barriers and the barricades, it really brought back the memories of those days in 2017, when the youth also managed to march through the gates and open through Bab Hutta Gate, and in their thousands, even carrying some martyrs' parents on their shoulders. And really that moment, although the makeup of the protesters was a bit different in 2017 to what it was in the Damascus Gate protests, but it really was a reminiscent. It was also reminiscent in 2014 in the protests that Jerusalem saw after the brutal killing of Muhammad Abu Khdeir in Shafat. We've seen also some protests in October 2015. One thread that unifies these protest movements, many of which were really spontaneous, largely leaderless, is that they are about reclaiming the public space. And in Jerusalem, it's a big thing because you don't really, one of the efforts that have been really strengthened by Israel is the way to control, to dominate the public space and to just prevent Palestinians from expressing themselves politically, publicly, artistically in the public space. So it's always been a battle over the public space, over who dominates the public space, who controls it, because it also applies to who controls the narrative and whose voices are heard. So, and in a sense, the protests in Sheikh Jarrah is an extension. Now, we're not naive to think that just couple of hundreds protesting might prevent Israel from carrying on its displacement plan. We know that we know the power and the might of the Israeli army, the Israeli police in terms of sheer brute force. And we know that it's absolutely asymmetric because the most we can, use is, in addition to our voices, is that for the youth to throw stones or bottles, and that's it really. So it's not even symmetric in this sense. But the really important thing is that it's emboldening more and more people to join. And it's making this case a public case. So it's absolutely putting pressure. And also, in a sense, it's also exposing the fragility of the Israeli army because despite its sheer brute force and its power, when you see that these soldiers are scared of a flag, and when you see that the very fact that we're standing there and singing is just enough to scare them and to bring all these special unit forces and border police and to use all these weapons, it also gives us more, it's hard to say, but it inspires even more courage among people, because if you're so fragile, if you're so weak, then you can't really intimidate us despite all that you've done. But we definitely know that just these protests are not enough. They need to be joined and backed up by genuine pressure that yields not just lip service, that supports these protests. But we also simultaneously realize that nothing will be changed and no displacement will be prevented unless these protests continue and manage to gather steam onward.
Thank you. That's a very powerful statement, I think, and I feel I'm inspired hearing you say it. I want to take a step back and go into the context a little bit. And Budour, I want to stay with you for a moment. Can we talk about, assuming that everyone who's on this call is seeing what's happening in the news, I don't assume that everyone knows the basics of Sheikh Jarrah and the people that live there, particularly the people who are under pressure now to be evicted. So can you talk about the population of Sheikh Jarrah? Who lives there? How long have they lived there? How did they get there? And of course, Sheikh Jarrah was part of the area of East Jerusalem that was annexed by Israel illegally in 1967. So maybe talk a little bit about what that meant for Palestinians who were already living in Sheikh Jarrah.
So I will probably start from one story, but I think her story is the story that is common to so many families in Sheikh Jarrah. She is Rifqa al-Kurd. She passed away last year at the age of over 100 years old. She was a buoyant, very passionate young woman in 1948, when in April, so in days like these, she and her family were displaced from the coastal city of Haifa. And Rifqa al-Kurd moved to Jerusalem first. And in 1956, like the other 28 families, she became obviously a refugee, like internally displaced but she was unlike other families who were displaced and remained in historic Palestine, in the areas occupied by Israel and then turned and called Israel. She moved to Jerusalem, which was then to East Jerusalem, which was then under the Jordanian control. So in 1956, UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Organization for Work, the Agency for Work and Refugees, and the Jordanian government, they leased this piece of land, and they agreed, the refugee families agreed to give up their refugee card in exchange of housing. And this has to do also with the terrible housing crisis that afflicted many Palestinian refugees and it was a very difficult decision to make. And it's not an easy, when a refugee is asked to make this decision between whether to stay a refugee or to accept a land and housing, it's very easy to put, I've heard it from many people that they regret that their parents had taken their decision. So obviously it's impossible to put yourself in their shoes. They had so many things to take into account, but then these families decided that it's better to live stably and to have a house of your own rather than just stay and live in a refugee camp for the entirety of their lives. So these families, these 28 families, agreed to exchange their refugee status for housing. According to the articles of the agreement between Jordan, the UNRWA, and the families, these families were supposed to get ownership over the land and over the houses after 3 years from constructing and building these houses. This never materialized. Obviously, in 1967, Israel completed its occupation of all of Jerusalem. So this part, all of Jerusalem now is under Israeli control and occupation and subsequent annexation also, including these refugee families that lived in Sheikh Jarrah. Immediately after the occupation in 1967, one of the first homes that were occupied was the Shanti family home because they were outside of Palestine at the time. So they declared it as abandoned property. Abandoned means that they prevented people from returning to this home and took over it to pave the way for a series of displacements. Starting from the early 1970s, Israel decided that this area, the claim was that the land on which these houses were built, that in the end of the 19th century, they were sold to Jewish families living there. This is one big contested issue regarding ownership. And the issue of ownership, legally speaking, I don't want to embroil you in the sophisticated legal technicalities, but the issue of ownership has not been sealed in the court. So there has not been a decision. What we know is that the responsible for absentee property registered the lands in Sheikh Jarrah in the name of settler organizations, based on what we Palestinians argue, based on false documents that have not proven. And in fact, the families have brought documents from Istanbul, from Turkey, that show that some of these documents that the settlers brought are forged documents. But it's a massive issue. And I think one of the successes, in a sense, of the settlers was to transform this issue from a struggle over land to merely bureaucratic property, real estate issue, when it's not. The real reason that these settler organizations led by Nahlat Shimon right now want to take advantage and want to control these homes in Sheikh Jarrah is the strategic position of Sheikh Jarrah. It's the gateway. It's in the north of the old city. It's north to the old city. It's a very strategic area, and it's also kind of one of the. It connects east to west as well. So it's a strategic, just like, for example, Silwan, it's a very strategic area because it's very close to Al-Aqsa Mosque. So the strategic place of Sheikh Jarrah is the reason that's pushing settlers to try and dominate it. And then obviously you can always use whatever pretext that the law allows you to use in order to take advantage of the loopholes that you have in order to control these houses and this land. And since 1970s, and specifically since the early 1980s, because some families, not knowing the Israeli law and tricked by one Israeli lawyer, because at the time Palestinian lawyers were not allowed, were on strike, and they didn't recognize the legitimacy of the Israeli courts, so they didn't represent Palestinian families. So one of the Israeli lawyers compelled some of the families, not all the families, 18 families, to sign documents that say that they accept the claim of ownership made by the settlers, and they agree to be considered protected tenants, which means just pay rent to the settler organization. And the problem with that agreement is that those who signed it did not really recognize what it entailed, because they couldn't speak Hebrew, because they trusted the lawyer, and it turned out that they were tricked. And all of these sophistications and legal mishmash led us to where we are, or where we started off at the early 2000s, when efforts by Nahlat Shimon, which is the main settler organization, which is also government supported, also, to make it clear. So it's not just one charitable organization, it left to its own devices. It's left us with the first displacements that took place in 2008 and 2009. Many of us remember the case of Kamil al-Kurd, whose husband has passed away during these months of threats, and who set up a tent to protest the evictions and displacement. We remember the family of Rifq al-Kurd, whose son built a house in 2000. He was prevented from living in that house because the Israeli court said that this extension of the house is illegal because he didn't receive a permit. Obviously, the vast majority of Palestinians in Jerusalem who apply for permits, their applications are turned down. So between 2000 and 2008, Nabil couldn't even enter the room he expanded and added to his home. His children had to watch this newly constructed room that they didn't even have the key to it. They couldn't even enter it. And suddenly in 2008, 2009, when the Israeli settlers took over the house, they managed to enter this part of the home, and they managed for years since then to share this home, which Nabil built, which Nabil and his family spent their entire work, labor, and sweat in order to build this house. They have to contend with watching settlers, especially settler youth. It's very important to make it clear that the majority of those who live in Sheikh Jarrah as Israeli settlers, they're paradigmatic colonists. They're youth, they're armed to the teeth, they're very dangerous, they harass the citizens. So instead, in addition to living and sharing the breath the air that these people breathe, they also harass them on a daily basis. And in addition to Al-Kurd family, also Al-Ghawi family also were displaced. And as Aseel mentioned, the case of Shamasni, although he's not a refugee, but also he was one of those, he lived since the 60s in Sheikh Jarrah and who was displaced in 2017. So this is the basis of the case. I think Aseel will talk more about the disparity and about how you live in two parallel worlds, in which on the one hand, you have Palestinians, internally displaced Palestinian refugees who have been displaced from their own land since 1948, including families, as I said, Rifq al-Kurd from Haifa, and families who came from Jaffa, and families who are from Al-Baq'a, which is in the western part of Jerusalem, and they can't go back to their homes, and they are not granted the right to return to their homes. And on the other hand, you have on fuzzy and on unproven proper ownership claims, you have Israelis who just the very fact that they claim that their land has been theirs since the 19th century. The Israeli law allows them to go, supposedly to go back or to take over the land. And I think Aseel can talk about these, how you have this system, this legal segregation, this legal apartheid system in which one population based on ethnicity and religion have the right to go back to their homes and the other doesn't.
Thanks, Budour. Actually, Aseel, I think that's actually a really good follow-on. We covered a lot of what I want to ask you. You know, the issue of law has come up over and over so far. And one of the things, I remember someone telling me this 25 years ago, when understanding Israeli rule in East Jerusalem and the West Bank is the difference between rule of law and rule by law. And that in this context, Israeli law is used in order to implement what the Israeli policy is. And that's not rule of law. To the extent that, I mean, what's striking to me, listening to both of you, is thinking about the lengths that the Israeli government has gone to legalize illegal settler construction, to the extent of literally suspending even the pretense of rule of law to say, fine, you took it illegally, it's privately ordered, we're still going to let you keep it because it's more humane, right? It's the argument that it's inhumane to ask settlers to leave, even if they built illegally. While the other hand is doing everything to dispossess and displace Palestinians, saying, sorry, it's the law, there's nothing we can do. So, you know, following up on what Budour said, and we've seen the Human Rights Report, which, you know, highlights the growing international recognition or normalization of the term apartheid when we're talking about this. Can you talk about that? Talk about how that framework applies, or how it should be used to understand what we're seeing today in Sheikh Jarrah. And you know, this is an opportunity also if you want to talk a little bit, for instance, what's happening in Silwan, where there's a massive looming displacement happening. It's not just Sheikh Jarrah.
I think these are excellent questions to go into the broader context of what enables such evictions. And I would like to start by saying you mentioned apartheid, and indeed Israel is an apartheid regime, but I think also to clearly and specifically illustrate the Israeli regime as it is, apartheid is also a symptom of settler colonialism, because Israel, when it was established in 1948, was established on the logic of the elimination of the Palestinian people and replacing it with Jewish settlers. So this is what the frame that captures what is the Israeli regime. Now, Israel, in order to enforce further dispossession after the Nakba or the 1948 war of the Palestinian people, and to ensure that the Palestinians are not returned to their homes and that there are further displacement and dispossession, it enacted, as you said, a series of laws. Now, these laws, when we look at them, they cause injustice to the Palestinian people. And one such law that affects the people of Sheikh Jarrah, but many other Palestinians, is the 1950 so-called absentee property law, which states that Palestinian refugees and Palestinian internally displaced during the 1948 Nakba they are considered absentees, although under another set of laws, citizenship laws and entry laws, they are denied their right to return. I myself, I'm a descendant of a refugee from the western part of Jerusalem, from one of the 500 displaced and demolished villages called Lifta. So I personally not only don't have the access to reclaim the property of my grandparents, but I also don't have access to even enter the city of Jerusalem because of other policies, including the annexation wall and the permit system. But basically, just to focus on this law allocates all the properties of the refugees for they are eligible for confiscation by the state. And if you see the contradictory that also Budour highlighted, you have another set of laws that only allows Israeli Jews to so-called law of return, which allows any Jew in the world to enter Israel and to be granted citizenship and nationality upon entry. Sometimes these Jews don't even if you want to go case by case, they're not even Jewish in religion. But anyhow, these Jewish people from all over the world are allowed to enter Israel and to be allowed the Israeli nationality. Now, on the other hand, we have, for example, the this is a very specific, a law specific to the cases of Sheikh Jarrah also, that has allowed the evictions going on right now. It was passed in 1970, specifically to East Jerusalem, and it states that only Israeli Jews are allowed to pursue claims to property that they allege to have owned in East Jerusalem before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And so pursuant to this law, these settler organizations have managed to secure land ownership, as you said, in Karm al-Jaouni area, and as Budour said, in Karm al-Jaouni area and Sheikh Jarrah, but also in other parts of Jerusalem, specifically in Batn al-Hawa and in Silwan, in occupied East Jerusalem also. We have a plot of land that have been secured, transferred to a settler organization, Atarit Kohanim, in 2001 or 2. And since then, the settler organization have also been filing eviction lawsuits against the families in Silwan and Batn al-Hawa. And also now the struggle is very much similar, because the people of Silwan are also, most of them, 80% of them are refugees, if not from 1948, but from the 67 war. So we're talking about a double displacement and dispossession experienced by the Palestinian people. We're talking about a very psychologically and also financially exhausting struggle within these Israeli courts that are very discriminatory and are enforcing discriminatory laws that constitute the foundation of Israel's apartheid regime, because Israel is not only basing its displacement and dispossession on laws, but also it has been conducting various policies to ensure the maintenance of its apartheid regime, including the strategic fragmentation of the Palestinian people. Now we see Palestinians abroad, refugees and in exiles are denied the right to return as a first category. Palestinian in the Gaza Strip under a severe and harsh blockade for above 13 years now. Palestinians in the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, facing a military rule, and also Palestinian in East Jerusalem as also an occupied territory, but facing another set of laws with the same goal, as I mentioned, including the policy, for example, of residency revocation, where they're not allowed they're considered they are awarded a permanent residency status, which is in many cases revoked under very broad criteria, including if they don't succeed in proving that the so-called center of their life is in the city of Jerusalem, then they are at threat of losing their residency status. In other cases, they are asked to breathe. I'm sorry, the English word is missing from me, but they to swear allegiance for the occupying power, because they are protesting or resisting the illegal policies of the Israeli occupation. And so many Palestinians, I think 14,000 Palestinians, have lost their residency status because of this policy. The last category of this strategic fragmentation policy is Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are also facing discriminatory measures and policies by Israel, including forcible transfer, for example, in the Naqab area, but also another discriminatory allocation of services. And we're seeing this very explicitly and shamelessly in laws that state of the Israeli state that state that only Jewish people have the right to self-determination. And so this is the second method. But the third method, which is also very relevant to what we started, is how Israel suppresses Palestinians since its inception in 1948. Any form of resistance, including to raise your Palestinian flag, is considered a criminal act. And this policy of suppression includes many acts, including the use of force. Yesterday, a Palestinian boy was killed in Nablus. He's, I think, 15 years old, by Israeli occupying forces. This is not a unique incident. This is unfortunately an incident that Palestinians have to accept as the norm. The use of force, the arbitrary detention. Currently in Sheikh Jarrah, many Palestinians are being detained. And as Budour said, we have seen in the protests, many Palestinians coming from inside the Green Line, from Haifa and so on, also in detention centers where for a preliminary monitoring by Al-Haq, we can say that there are beatings in these detention centers. Further investigation, like torture, is not something weird torture is another means to suppress Palestinian resistance, and it's sanctioned by Israeli courts. I don't want to go along with this, but just to highlight that Israel uses all these different methods to suppress the Palestinian will to resist the illegal and ongoing settler colonial policies. And this proves an element of the crime of apartheid, which is the intention to maintain an apartheid regime.
Thanks, and that's very powerful. So following up on that, Budour, with that as the context, and you spoke in a way that was very inspiring earlier. Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and beyond Sheikh Jarrah, but we're focusing on Sheikh Jarrah today, have long resisted occupation in Sheikh Jarrah. They've long resisted efforts at eviction. In the past, those have not been long-term successful efforts. Talk about why this resistance, how it looks now, how it is different, how it feels different than what we've seen in the past.
You know, when we think, sometimes this can be a bit of a risky question to answer, really, because sometimes you can be easily caught in the heat of the moment. And then we tend to think whatever we've living through now is different from anything we've lived through before. And we have this kind of, our memory tends to flag certain things and to be selective. So I don't want to say how it's different from what we've seen before. Rather, I want to think indifferently how it accumulates and it builds on what we've seen before. And I think this is really important, because when we tell the Palestinian story, we tend, and justly, obviously, and justifiably, to focus on what Israel does to Palestinians. There have been so many, I mean, Aseel enumerated them so well, all these. I mean, we're talking about, there is certain hierarchy of oppression. The only common thing is that it applies to all Palestinians, even if different methods applies to certain part of the population. And there is this very well buttressed architecture of oppression that has been solid, that has been backed, supported by the Israeli judiciary and enforced by different sectors of the arms of the Israeli states, including their proxy, because we believe that the same settlers who 2 weeks ago marched through the streets of Jerusalem and screamed death to Arabs, they're not an anomaly. They're supported, they're backed, they're legitimized by the Israeli state. And in a sense, they do the state's dirty work. So the things that the state does not want to be seen doing, it prefers that the settlers, the Hilltop-set youth, for instance, or these very religious extremists do in the streets, in order, because they don't have the same political diplomatic considerations that the state arms have. So this is, as I said, Aseel went through these tools, but this is just one part of the story. The other part is that since 1948, throughout Palestine, there have been so many forms of Palestinian resistance, starting from the Palestinians who lived who stayed on their lands, including our families that stayed in their land and they were not successfully displaced in 1948, and they had to live under military rule from 1948 to 1966. So even though they were completely cut off from the entirety of the Palestinian people, and they were basically destroyed emotionally, physically, they were uprooted. Even though they stayed on their land, they were uprooted because they lost their natural extension. They still managed to go through to lead protests. We saw the protest, the historic Land Day protests in 1976, which Palestinians did in order to protest against mass land confiscation and to assert their Palestinian identity despite Israeli attempts to domesticate them, to treat them as Israel, to call them Arab Israelis, and by that denying and erasing their Palestinian identity. We've seen the first Intifada, which was the first major mobilization within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip that was popularly led by Palestinians, and whose heritage and whose legacy continues to inspire us until today through its songs, through its icons, through its tactics and the strategies employed, even though the Palestinian society in its nature has changed drastically after the Oslo Accords and after all the efforts by Israel and the Palestinian Authority, I have to say, in order to suppress Palestinian resistance. And we've seen the Second Intifada, and we've seen all the movements we've talked about in Jerusalem, starting from piecemeal activism and just cultural activism through the streets of Jerusalem to reclaim and to stress the identity of Jerusalem as a Palestinian city, and starting from the protests currently taking place throughout Palestine, historic Palestine, against internal violence, which is supported directly by Israel, and the complicity of the Israeli police, which is intent on fragmenting and dividing the Palestinian people and stripping them of their natural, as I said, natural expansion and natural environment, and just creating ghettoized communities in which Palestinians throughout Palestine have less and less land, less and less space, have absolutely no future horizons. So all of this can be seen and can be manifested in the anger, in the outrage we're seeing in Sheikh Jarrah right now, in the anger and the outrage that we saw at the start of Ramadan through the youth who were fearlessly and tirelessly throwing stones at the Israeli police, even though they probably are not explicitly politically motivated. They don't use the terminology that many of us who are affiliated perhaps, or who have more, who have been engaged, more politically engaged, they might use different terminology, but it's not about terminology. There is a more powerful vocabulary that one you say, and it's how you act. And this process of recovering and reclaiming the consciousness is one, we tend to talk a lot about the visible forms of violence that Israel employs, and there are so many of them. There's so many crude forms of violence. Israel fires missiles at Gaza. Israel destroys them and demolishes homes in Jerusalem and forces Palestinians in Jerusalem to demolish their own homes. Israel raids entire villages in the West Bank at night and terrorizes families and terrorizes children through these detention raids. These are just one few examples of the visible forms of oppression that Israel has used. But there is a less visible form of violence, more which we can say invisibilized, or something, violence that is made invisible. It's not just through bureaucracy, it's an attempt to domesticate the Palestinian people and to eradicate their political and national consciousness, and to make impose this alienation on them. And this has never been clearer than in Jerusalem, because of the status of Palestinians in Jerusalem as permanent residents, because they have been separated from Palestinians in the West Bank through the annexation and expansion wall, through the checkpoints and the barriers, and also the psychological separation through the imposition of Israeli school curriculum on these children, through forcing these people to just go to the Israeli workforce and to work as manual laborer in Israeli settlements in the western part of Jerusalem, and all sorts of attempts attempts to eradicate their consciousness. Despite this, Israel always kind of has this banks on the fact that it has successfully domesticated Palestinian youth in Jerusalem. What we see is that one stone, one event, even small though it might sound, is enough to kind of dismantle this myth of a palace, of a people who have been subjugated, of a people who have been pacified. And this, whenever an explosion of so-called explosion happens, and this bubble of Israeli security and relative quiet bursts, many people act as if they were surprised. We've seen this in 2015, in October, in the uprising of October, after so many individual attacks by Palestinians. And these uprisings have different manifestations. Many people ask, why did this happen? And they act surprised. And now we're seeing this in Sheikh Jarrah. Why suddenly? Because these things have been happening in Sheikh Jarrah for a long time. And usually less people join than what we're seeing right now. It's usually the people of the neighborhood, sometimes even solidarity activists. But when it comes to Palestinians from Jerusalem, let's join Sheikh Jarrah. They're more focused on other areas of contention. So people ask why now. It's not the right question to ask why now. The right question to ask is, this explosion was always inevitable, because these policies, these Israeli policies of domestication, of fragmentation, of subjugation, and of dispossession, it's inevitable that they will yield resistance, and this resistance can take different forms. It's just that it's sometimes things take you by surprise, and sometimes it's not even those who always say the most politicized. Sometimes it's the least politicized people who take, because it's this sense of dignity. And this is, I think, I'm sorry, I've talked for so long, but this is one of the main fuel, the main fuel for what we're seeing now. This sense of dignity, this absolute insistence that we can't be mortified and we can't be humiliated. We reject to be humiliated. And when you feel that people, no matter how they express it, that they just want to reclaim their dignity and their freedom, they will take to the streets. And this will always, as long as Israel continues its policies, and no matter how many budgets it will dedicate to the eradication of Palestinian national consciousness and the erasure of Palestinian identity, these small acts and big acts of resistance, especially daily resistance that goes unseen on many occasions, will just continue to flourish and will just continue to explode. I mean, sometimes in the most unexpected of times.
Thank you. What is really striking when I'm listening to you and thinking about how I see this covered in the international press and the Israeli press, when people are looking for, why now, what is happening, and you see Israeli authorities demanding that Mahmoud Abbas stop it, right? Or that saying that Hamas is egging it on. And you think, Israel has done such a good job cutting off Jerusalem from Jerusalemites, from the rest of the Palestinian population, cutting out the PA completely, very effectively, but then wants to blame it when you have genuine grassroots popular, upsurge of engagement like this. And it is, I should point out for folks who are watching this on social media or aren't, I mean, this is unarmed engagement. This is not, when Israel treats any Palestinian resistance as terrorism, and look at what's happening on the ground. Watch the videos of people singing and clapping. The argument that this is some kind of organized political tool, or political parties or political actors, it just doesn't stand up to what we're seeing. And I think Budour has summed this up really, really powerfully and quite beautifully. Aseel, I want to turn to you and really maybe pull the camera out a little bit and talk about the international community, which is starting to speak up a little bit. You had the consul from the UK speaking quite powerfully about what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah a few days ago. We've had a few members of Congress speak out, not enough, but a few. What is the role of the international community, both for good and for bad, in where we've gotten to today, and potentially in ensuring that this doesn't end up with more people kicked out of their homes?
So basically, as you said, there's been some action by the international community, be it at the European EU level, but I would say that this action is very much inadequate. We've seen in the past couple of months statements condemning the illegal acts committed by the Israeli occupying forces. We've seen some representative offices visiting the people of Sheikh Jarrah. But I would like to highlight that we talked about the evictions in 2009, right? And since then, the position of the EU or the international committee has not changed. It's the same. It's condemnation statement. It's saying this is illegal under international law. And as Al-Haq, we've been trying to brief diplomats at the EU level. And with me was present Muhammad Al-Kurd. He's one of the residents of Sheikh Jarrah, and he's very vocal and powerful in his messages. Since his childhood, he's been trying to advocate for the rights of his family and the neighborhood of the Palestinian people. And in these briefings, Muhammad's message is very clear, and the demands of the families, he's representing the families, obviously, are very clear. They want concrete actions. Letters of condemnation, statements of condemnation are fine, but they want concrete actions. They want pressure on Israel. In terms of the legality or the legal obligation of these states, and what I was trying to highlight is that this is also very obvious. Third states or international community, since Israel is committing gross violations of human rights and international law, these violations necessitates obligation on all states of the international community and all countries to act, first of all, not to recognize the illegal situation, but also to positively cooperate to bring an end to the illegal situation. Now, cooperation in concrete measures can take the form of sanctions. As I said, since 2009, when we're just focusing on Sheikh Jarrah specifically, but as we said, Sheikh Jarrah is the case of Palestine. These evictions happened in 2009. Nothing has happened. If the letter of condemnation, the statement of condemnation will still remain the norm of the international community, the whole neighborhood, we're talking about 500 people in Sheikh Jarrah at risk of being displaced, but also Jerusalem and whole Palestinian people. So the concrete actions in fulfillment toward their obligations under international law, now it's necessary to look at these countermeasures, which are not a favor to ask from the international community. As I said, it's an international obligation. Examples of such measures include the economic and diplomatic sanctions, imposing an arms embargo on the Israeli occupying forces as well. So I think at this time, these pressures are very much needed to stop evictions in Sheikh Jarrah, but also to stop the whole illegal situation in Palestine.
Thanks. I think that, I think you laid it out really well. It's really hard looking at the situation. I can't believe we're saying today in 2021, this was true 20 years ago, and not seeing the international community's unwillingness to do more than the equivalent of, thoughts and prayers. It is complicity at a certain point. It is sending a clear message to Israel that aside from a little bit of diplomatic kerfuffle, it's going to get away with whatever it does, and the Palestinians will just have to suffer. That is, you can sort of say the first time, well, we did our best, we didn't know, but after decades of seeing how this plays out, it really is hard to see how that isn't direct complicity, given the degree of active support the international community shows for Israel in other areas. But that's just my view. Budour, I want to come back to you. I want to, and I'm going to ask you both about this in different ways. I want to talk about the question of justice, which is a big question. It's bigger than Sheikh Jarrah. But what would justice look like for the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah? And assuming that there was actual political will, whether in governments or at the grassroots level, and I think there's a lot of political at the grassroots level in the international community, how can the international community stand with Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah or in general on Jerusalem? Is it a matter of advocacy or funding the right organizations, or things like education seem far too long term to me to have much impact here? And are there any specific organizations that you think people should be following if they want to be effective allies?
Yeah. Oh, the question of justice is a broad philosophical, historical, political question. It's definitely not just a legal question. And definitely when we talk about justice, we don't deceive ourselves and even expect for a second that it's going to come from Israeli courts, obviously speaking, because we always, one of our chants is always, it's in Israel, the Supreme Court is referred to as the High Court of Justice. For us, it's the High Court of Injustice. And I think I'm old enough now by this age to know that when we were young and naive and innocent, we believed that if just we manage to go through, we can change the world through the use of law. First, probably locally, and then even internationally. And this is why some of us decided to study international law, thinking that the international law will bring justice. It may bring a semblance of accountability, but accountability is not justice. I think we've heard this a lot in the Black Lives Matter discourse, and this is very powerful, that even if one police officer is prosecuted and is indicted or prosecuted and sentenced, this might be a semblance of accountability. It's definitely not justice to the families the person who this police officer killed, to the families of those who are killed by the police, and definitely not to a solution to the generational injustices that have been committed, neither in the United States nor in our context. Now, here in the Palestinian context, we forget about it. We don't even talk about even accountability when it comes to the Israeli crimes through Israeli courts, because we know, regardless of how these courts want to portray themselves as upholding law and portraying themselves as some sort of guardians of justice and liberal justices, especially in the Supreme Court, we know that at the end of the day, they fulfill a certain mission. And this mission is that to entrench Israeli colonization and Israeli control. Now, internationally speaking, if we want to talk specifically about certain cases, about legal, let's keep ourselves within the parameters or the boundaries of legal justice. First, yes, you have the case before the ICC. Now, I'm not a huge fan of international law in general, and I do think that it's very incredibly limited as a tool, but it's a tool nonetheless. And it's a tool that puts real pressure on Israel. And the reaction of Israel to the decision of the ICC to recognize, to the chamber of the ICC to recognize that it does have a jurisdiction, and the eventual decision of the ICC to open an investigation into Israeli crimes. The Israeli response to it is telling. All of these attacks and attempt to demonize say that Israel does fear an investigation. And because Israel does fear it, it's regardless of how effective it's going to be, at least put pressure on Israel, make Israel feel that it's at least it's not going to continue committing its crimes with absolute impunity as it has been doing for more than 7 decades. So I think it's important to support the ICC investigation as a minimum. I mean, it's the least that they can do, at least to support the ICC investigation if they're really concerned about the rule of law, and to acknowledge that if these evictions and displacements, because eviction can be a very neutral, deceptively neutral term, if these displacements are materialized, it's a war crime, as is settlements, as are the mass killings that we saw during the March of Return, as are the Israeli crimes that were committed against Gaza in 2014, as the crime of apartheid. So if these crimes continue, at least Israel must know that it risks the threat of being held accountable, that its officials, including from its prime ministers to its soldiers to its officers, can travel freely. They should they should live under this, at least under this threat, even if no arrests happen. Now, this is when it comes to legal justice, and it's very important, or at least legal, some sort of legal accountability. Now, when it comes to the broader definition of justice, I mean, this will require a whole reframing of the debate. We definitely can't keep repeating the same broken record of two states, of borders, of let's just do certain, I mean, of certain just restitution, empty terminology. We simply have to abandon this debate once and for all. Not only because the two-state solutions, in my opinion, it's never been credible in the first place as a solution, but not just because of that. Even if it was conceived of at some stage, it's long been dead and buried. It's funerals. Israel was the one who was responsible for holding its first funeral, basically. So we can't keep just caging ourselves in this nonsensical, in my opinion, debate. We really have to ask what justice means. What justice means for the refugees who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 and who were prohibited from returning to their land. What justice means for the president of Sheikh Jarrah, who goes to the western part of Jerusalem and sees his own home in Baq'a and is unable to return to it, is unable to even approach it. What justice means for all those Palestinian refugees, for the internally displaced, for those who have lost loved ones. And obviously for us, it doesn't mean retaliation or reprisals, but it means real restitution. It means real reparations. It means right of return. It means changing the whole parameters of the debate to make it a debate enshrined and established upon decolonization, because really you can't just stay within and cage yourself within the boundaries of 1967 and after that. It's impossible. Sheikh Jarrah encapsulates the fact that if you want to understand the Palestinian cause, you have to get way before 1967, even way before 1948. 1948 was the first mass crowning for Israel. Obviously, for us, it was the disastrous consequence of things that happened before, of policies that began before. So really, decolonization in the sense and building a truly, genuinely democratic country based not on religious supremacy or ethnic supremacy, but based on the respect for universally respected human rights for all, regardless of religious, gender, or nationality. This is, for me, this is what justice looks like. Justice looks like being able to walk wherever I want as a Palestinian without living under the threat of the checkpoints and the threat of being attacked or harassed or bullied. It also means being able to build a country that respects everyone who lives in this country, that respects their right, that respects their freedoms, even if they were not born in the so-called wrong religion. And it also, and most importantly, it means listening to Palestinian voices. And I'm very grateful to you for allowing us to speak, because for so long, the whole debate, even those who have some good intention, when they want to hear what's going on, at the best cases, they will go and turn to either Israeli human rights organizations or international human rights organizations. And perhaps the discussion of apartheid is one really proof of that, because so many Palestinians have been saying certain things for decades, really, and no one is listening to us. Now, when one Israeli organization or international organizations comes ahead and repeats what we've been saying for decades, suddenly people at least start to listen. Now, I know that it's not just about discourse and framing, and discourse is just one face of it. It's just one small face of it, really. I mean, our battle is much more important than just a battle over discourse. But it does matter who you listen to and how you build and draw your own narrative. And when you're only allowed to and give space to Israeli organizations and give legitimacy to just when Israeli critics criticize Israel, and just don't even prepare yourself to listen to the more uncomfortable for some, because I know that our voices might appear like inconvenience for some. And this gives us a problem. So at least let's reclaim the discourse as Palestinians. That's just a first step, and listen from Palestinians how they perceive the future solution to be. I don't know. I mean, I'm just one individual, really. Justice means different things to different people and to different individuals, and it's going to take a hell lot of struggle and just so much efforts to do in order to know what really justice looks like. What I'm certain of is that justice can never be achieved in Palestine without the recognition of the right of return and without decolonization.
Thank you. And I want to say we're very honored to have your voices here. Part of our modus operandi at the foundation is recognizing the failures for many years to center Palestinian voices in these conversations, in these narratives, and we are consciously working to fix that. So it is not by accident that we're doing this today. Aseel, I want to give you an opportunity if you want to add anything here on the question of justice. Also, and we're going to run over time, I'm going to take the luxury of being the chair to say we're going to give you the chance to add something here. Also, if you want to talk about that, that's fine. If instead you want to talk about maybe the next couple of weeks and what we are looking ahead to with Jerusalem Day and the March of Flags and end of Ramadan and sort of, the potential for an escalation in Jerusalem, which I think a lot of us are worried about. But this will be the last word.
I very much agree with everything Budour has said about justice, but I do want to stress on some points because I actually did my master's thesis on transitional justice because often much as Palestinians, as Budour said, we're much forcibly trapped to convince others of the injustice that is going on currently. And we're not left with much space to think about the future of Palestine, right? So what I try to do when I try to imagine, to look at the future of Palestine within the framework or the body of transitional justice, which basically is the body that looks about situation transitioning from previous, be it a war or a conflict or transitioning from a democratic regime towards a new era where a transition is going on and ushered in a justice manner. And there are many elements of or components of this transitional justice field, including the element of truth, and then the element of accountability, which Budour also highlighted. There's also the reforms, reparations, which also Budour highlighted, and guarantees of non-repetition. And when I looked at Palestine, I realized that to have the first step, which is the truth or acknowledgement, this is not even acknowledged for the Palestinian people. We're not even there at the acknowledgement or truth. As Budour said, we have been also trapped in a discourse that has been maintained by various actors, including sometimes, unfortunately, the Palestinian political leadership, which frames the situation as a conflict and limits the Palestinian territory to 22% of historic Palestine, and also excludes the mass majority of the Palestinian people, be it the Palestinian refugees abroad and exiled or Palestinian citizens of Israel from any future of Palestine. So basically this discourse that frames the situation as a conflict in the occupied Palestinian territory is very much problematic because we need to look at, when we want to see the truth and to have acknowledgement for this truth, we need to go back into the history, because Israel is an ongoing settler colonial state. Not the same, but the same goal with different means and tactics have been used to implement this settler colonial regime since 1948. And so the reclamation of this narrative from turning it from a conflict paradigm into a settler colonial situation makes us also think about how we see the solution for this problem. Instead of seeking peace process and conflict resolution mechanisms, we look at the situation as an anti-colonial movement. We're seeking decolonization. We're seeking all the elements that I listed. And in the case of Israel, reforms is not even acceptable because we want to dismantle all these discriminatory laws and policies in terms of reparations, because Israel has the logic that all the Palestinians should be displaced and eliminated. It does consider the Palestinian refugees by public statements as a threat to the Israeli state. Palestinian refugees' right to return is a right. It's not a threat to the state. And if we dismantle this logic that controls all the policies and laws, then we can provide the reparations, including the right to return that Budour has said, and the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. And just to also conclude, I do believe the prosecutions as one tool are important, but they cannot also ensure that an entire structure of power as a regime is prosecuted. It's only the current investigation at the criminal court will contribute to the, if it happens, to the ending the cycle of impunity that Israel has enjoyed for above 70 years. It will send a strong message that for the first time, Israel is to be held accountable, but justice is more than that for Palestinians. And law is just a tool, and it has very much short, it is very much limited towards the liberation and decolonization of Palestine. And in order to arrive at this future, I think two important things need to be done. First of all, the Palestinian political leadership has a critical role in this regard because it has given up its role as an anti-colonial movement and liberation movement towards into a movement that seeks state building without even the Palestinian people, and on a state that is not constitute only 22% of historic Palestine. So we want a political leadership that is calling for our rights as a whole, not fragmented, and including the right to return of refugees and also the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And not to repeat what I said about the international community's role, it is important that concrete measures are taken now, including sanctions, so that all this justice that Palestine and Sheikh Jarrah deserve is fulfilled.
Thank you very much. And actually, thanks to both of you. We're going to close this out here. This was a very rich discussion. I hope that we can have you both back and we can continue this discussion because I have a lot more questions. I want to thank both of you for joining us today. I want to thank everyone who joined us on Zoom and on Facebook, and for everyone who gave us questions. We got to as many as we could. The ones that we didn't get to, we will share in writing with our panelists so they know what you are interested in, and that can help inform them as they think about these things. I want to give a shout out. It's actually a great follow-up to Aseel's last comment. We have a webinar coming up from the Foundation for Middle East Peace, hosting on May 12th, the webinar entitled "The PLO and the Palestinian Diaspora, Reviving a Source of Power," which will be with the authors of a recent report by Al-Shabaka, which is on this exact topic. We are also co-sponsoring an event on May 10th on the Palestinian Nakba, what happened in 1948 and why it still matters. You can find information about both of these at the Foundation for Middle East Peace website, fmep.org, along with very soon a recording of this webinar and links to all of the amazing resources that were shared in the chat. So thank you all. And with that, we will close this for today. And thank you again.